The best way to get better is to practice. And in this example, we're going to look at how to create a contact form. As always, these files are available using a link provided below in the description. We'll pause for about 5 seconds so you can download that. You can choose to either follow along or attempt on your own and check your answer at the end. All right, so let's get started. Here I have a comment with all my to-dos on how I want to create my HTML form. So I've already got my form tags, so I'm going to put these inside of my form. Now what I'm going to do is a little bit different than our previous examples, and I'm going to use a div tag. This is pretty common to group elements together. This is not as complicated as a section tag, which we talked about before, and can be used for simply grouping things like form elements together or other pieces of content. So I have my first div tag. A div tag is a block level tag, so this will put on its own separate row. Then I need to create a label tag, which is going to contain text for the user's name. And we're simply going to call it name. Then we're going to have an input tag of type text. This is the default type, but we always like to put in just so we don't leave things out. ID of name, and then we're going to give the name. Remember, the ID is used for referencing the for attribute in the label, as well as any scripting you might use. And the name is what gets sent to the form processor. So that's all we need to do. We're pretty familiar with this. But now I'm going to create a couple of new input tags that use a different type, and we can see how the browser handles that. So first, I'm going to have a div, a label for my phone. So I'm just going to use that as phone. An input tag with a type of, and you're going to notice that phone is not an option. So you might say, well, wait a second, what can I do if phone is not an option? Well, we do have tel. Tel is short for telephone. And so this is the type that we want to use if we're going to have a phone number. So then we're going to put an ID phone, and our name will also be phone. Create a new div, label for email. And now we're going to put in an email address. So use another input, type, and you notice that email is an option. Set my ID and my name to both be email, and we'll be done. Finally, we're going to need the actual comments for our comment form. So once again, I'm going to have another div. And instead of using a input of type text, which is a single line, we want them to be able to use multiple lines. So I'm going to use a TextArea. Now, one thing you're going to notice a little bit differently is our TextArea actually has a closing tag. Very different from our input. Finally, one last div. And with this one, we're just going to use a button. Type submit, and we'll say send comments. Now right click in my files section, reveal in File Explorer, double click on this file, and here's my basic form. Now I've added some basic CSS, and you can look at the file 10-3.css in your CSS folder to see what I've done. Basically making the labels bolded and some basic things like that. I can put in my name, John, for example, a phone number, and you notice it takes that just fine. However, you're going to also notice it takes letters, spaces, characters, etc. So your phone is supposed to be for phone numbers, but it really allows you to put almost anything in. That's because it's up to your browser to determine how is it going to handle this. Let's see this again. Notice that I put a hash mark instead of the @ symbol. It accepted it. The browser handles this just fine. And so it's really up to the browser. Other browsers may handle this very differently. You have to determine how is your browser going to handle this. So that's something that's important to remember. Just because we use the right value in our type attribute does not mean that your browser is going to properly handle it. So just keep that in mind when working with your tag. This is why it's often very helpful to use something like JavaScript or a back-end form validator. Up next, we're going to show you how to create another form. This time, how do you handle something like a checkout form? We're going to have things like radio buttons and checkboxes. So if you want to take a look at that, click on the video that's on the screen now.